Hi, I'm John Gimigliano, Principal in charge of KPMG's Federal Legislative and Regulatory Services Group in Washington National Tax. Thanks for joining me today. On November 6th, KPMG sponsored and co-hosted a post-election event with Bloomberg BNA where several key Capitol Hill tax writing staffers talked about the prospects for tax legislation in the wake of the recent midterm elections. We covered a number of interesting topics, including the importance of revenue estimates for tax legislation. For that discussion, we were joined by two former heads of joint tax, John Buckley and Ken Keyes, as well as by Russ Sullivan, former staff director at the Senate Finance Committee. I understand to those not regularly involved in developing tax legislation, the topic of revenue estimates seems a little mundane. That the function of revenue estimates is to simply tally up the policy choices made by congressional tax writers. I can tell you, however, from personal experience, that to those developing the legislation, the opposite often seems true. That is, the budgetary constraints and therefore the revenue estimates themselves often serve as a straitjacket to the policy choices that tax writers would like to make. That is why the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, the developers of the tax estimates, can be so very influential in the tax legislative process. The panel on revenue estimates focused in particular on one very important topic, and that is the methodology used by joint tax and whether altering that method might lead to different policy choices in tax legislation. Specifically, many have argued that the joint tax revenue model, which generally does not account for macroeconomic effects of the tax law changes, such as the growth in GNP, is not the most accurate measuring stick for tax legislation's effects. That line of logic further suggests that if those beneficial macroeconomic effects of tax legislation were to be taken into account, that the cost of implementing lower tax rates could be less than under the traditional scoring methodologies and therefore easier to enact. Ken Keyes and John Buckley pointed out in their discussion that while exploring the broader use of dynamic estimates may be worthwhile, there are challenges to overcome in doing so. In particular, there is no one accepted macroeconomic model. In choosing one model over another, certain fundamental assumptions are implicated, including those related to monetary policy, labor supply, etc. Thus, selecting a particular model could be viewed as reflecting certain biases of the selector. This raises the possibility of partisan bickering over what has mostly been, up until now, a nonpartisan issue. The panelists also note that adopting dynamic scoring for tax legislation could lead to similar dynamic scoring for all spending proposals as well. Achieving bipartisan consensus on adopting dynamic scoring for both could be challenging. The issue of dynamic revenue estimates is one that most expect to get greater attention in 2015 as lawmakers look for ways to break the stalemate on tax reform, and it's certainly one that we'll be following closely. That's just a brief summary of a very complex but very interesting discussion on the use of dynamic revenue estimates. You can watch the full webcast replay of this session by clicking on the link below. Thanks again for joining me today, and please, if you have any questions on this topic, you can contact me, John Gimigliano, at the contact information on your screen.